Hello! This is a story that took place in the quiet suburbs of Marion County, Florida, a place where a seemingly peaceful life turned into a nightmare. At the center of it all is Helmut Victor Stefan Lockner, a 93-year-old man who, after 60 years of marriage, found himself accused of attempting to take the life of the woman he had once vowed to cherish. In this story, we will explore the chilling events leading up to that fateful day, the shocking twists in the investigation, and the legal proceedings that followed. Was it a crime fueled by a deteriorating mind or something darker? Join me as we unravel the truth behind this case and witness the ultimate consequences that come when the law meets a crime that cannot be ignored. In the peaceful neighborhoods of southwest Marion County, Florida, the tranquility of everyday life often masks the hidden stories of its residents. For decades, Helmut Victor Stefan Lockner and his wife had lived in their modest home surrounded by greenery and calm. It was a place where they'd celebrated over 60 years of marriage, a place that had witnessed joy, laughter, and countless memories. But on the afternoon of October 26th, everything changed. That day, what should have been another peaceful afternoon turned into a nightmare. The sound of a 911 call would be the first sign that something was horribly wrong. A woman struggling to breathe cried out into the phone, He tried to kill me. Please send help." On the other end, the dispatcher stayed calm, asking for details. The woman explained that her husband, in a sudden and violent act, had attacked her. He had wrapped a rope around her neck and tightened it, cutting off her airflow. But somehow she had managed to free herself and dial for help. As she spoke, her voice was filled with panic, but also a sense of disbelief. When the officers arrived, they found the woman sitting outside on the porch, her face streaked with tears and blood visible on her left arm. She looked frail, almost as though the weight of the world had collapsed onto her. Inside the house, her husband, Helmut Lockner, sat silently on the couch, almost appearing detached from the chaos. Detective Jonathan Coleman, who had seen his fair share of crime scenes, immediately recognized the unease in the atmosphere. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The smell of old wood and the faint hum of a television filled the air, but something was undeniably off. Coleman walked through the living room, taking note of the family photos on the walls, the neatly arranged furniture, and the soft lighting that filled the space. It seemed like any other home, until you looked closer. Lochner's wife recounted the events in a shaky voice. She and her husband had been sitting together watching television when he stood up without warning. He moved behind her, reached for a rope, and began to strangle her. Her memory of the exact moment was fragmented, but one thing was clear. The man she had shared her life with for 6 decades had turned violent in an instant. What came next was even more chilling. When police questioned Lochner about the attack, he gave a response that would haunt anyone who heard it. "I'm dying," he said flatly. "I don't want to leave her alone. I wanted to end it for both of us." This wasn't a senseless crime. It was an act driven by fear and confusion, by a man who believed his love for his wife was all that mattered in his final days. The tragedy here was not just in the physical attack, but in the broken mind behind it. For over 6 decades, Helmut and his wife had shared a life together. Their marriage, long by any standard, was a testament to time, resilience, and what appeared to be unwavering love. But like many long-term relationships, there were layers beneath the surface, layers that were hidden from the outside world. Neighbors and friends often spoke of them as a couple who had endured the test of time. They were known for their calm, predictable lives, rarely causing a stir in the small community. Yet, behind closed doors, their relationship had quietly aged too. As time wore on, it seemed that the love they once shared had become something else entirely. Helmut, now 93 years old, was no longer the man he once was. Aging had taken its toll on his body and mind. His wife, equally frail but still clinging to a sense of normalcy, had been his companion through all of it. Yet, as the years passed, something darker began to emerge. A mixture of fear, loneliness, and perhaps a sense of guilt. Their home, once a place of laughter, had slowly become a prison of memories, of regrets, and perhaps most tragically, of growing despair. Before the events of October 26th, there had been whispers. No one had heard the full story, but there had been signs, small, almost imperceptible signs, that something was wrong. A neighbor who had known them both for years recalled an incident a few weeks before the attack. She remembered seeing Helmut and his wife walking down the street, and while the couple had always appeared polite and composed, there was something different about that day. The wife, who had always been the more outgoing one, seemed to be unusually quiet. Her eyes avoided contact, and she appeared to be constantly looking over her shoulder as if afraid of something. Helmut, too, looked tired, his gait slower than usual. It was clear he was aging, but there was something more to it, a sense of unease that wasn't there before. According to reports, this wasn't the first time Helmut had acted violently toward his wife. A few weeks before the rope incident, the wife had spoken to detectives about another alarming encounter. This time, while they were lying in bed, Helmut had tried to suffocate her with a pillow. She had struggled to breathe, but miraculously she managed to push the pillow away, gasping for air. The memory of that moment was vivid in her mind, her heart racing, her body fighting for survival as her husband's hands pressed the pillow down harder. She had no explanation for his actions, only a growing sense of dread that perhaps the man she had lived with for over 60 years had changed into something unrecognizable. When Helmut spoke to the police after his arrest, his words carried a weight that sent chills through everyone who heard them. He admitted, with a strange mixture of guilt and resignation, that he had planned to end both of their lives. It wasn't a confession made out of pure malice. There was a haunting sense of hopelessness in his voice. A man who feared the loneliness of his remaining days so much that he believed taking his wife with him was the only solution. As the investigation unfolded, the authorities worked quickly to piece together the shocking events that had occurred inside the Lockner home. Detective Jonathan Coleman, a seasoned investigator, was no stranger to disturbing cases, but this one struck a deeper chord. The crime scene was chillingly quiet. The home, which had once been a symbol of comfort, now felt like a stark reminder of a love turned dark. The living room, where Helmut had allegedly attacked his wife, was small and cozy, an area with a worn-out couch, a couple of old chairs, and a faded rug. The faint smell of dust and stale air hung in the room, giving it an unsettling, almost suffocating feel. At first glance, there was nothing about the scene that screamed danger. The furniture was neatly arranged, the television was still on, and the window blinds were drawn. It was hard to imagine that only moments before, a woman had been fighting for her life. The officers and investigators moved carefully through the house, looking for any signs that could explain what had happened. The first piece of evidence they found was the rope, a thick, frayed length of cord that had been used in the attempted strangulation. It was still on the floor next to the couch where Helmut had sat. The investigators noted the texture of the rope, weathered, likely old, but still strong enough to serve its sinister purpose. Detective Coleman took a moment to reflect on the brutality of the act. He knew that there was more to the story than what was immediately apparent. The physical evidence, blood on the victim's arm, the disheveled nature of the room, was telling, but it was the psychological elements that needed further exploration. The wife's testimony, a desperate struggle for survival. The victim, Helmut's wife, was understandably shaken, but she bravely recounted the terrifying events to the police. She spoke of the moments leading up to the attack, trying to make sense of what had happened. The two had been sitting together in their usual spot, watching television as they did most evenings. It was a mundane, peaceful evening. At least that's what it appeared to be. Then, without warning, Helmut stood up, walked behind her, and wrapped the rope around her neck. She struggled immediately, feeling the constriction of the rope as it cut off her air supply. It wasn't just the physical pain that terrified her. It was the fact that her own husband, the man she had spent her life with, was trying to take it all away. The panic set in quickly. Her mind raced as she fought to remove the rope, her body becoming weaker and weaker from the lack of oxygen. But somehow she managed to free herself, gasping for air as she scrambled to safety. It was a terrifying ordeal, one that left her shaken to her core. As the investigation continued, more details emerged that painted a troubling picture of the couple's past. Detectives began to dig into Helmut's history, trying to understand what had led him to such a violent outburst. What they uncovered was both heartbreaking and disturbing. Helmut, though elderly and frail, had a past that suggested he had long been struggling with his mental health. Friends and family members spoke of his growing paranoia in recent years, his increasing withdrawal from social activities, and his inability to come to terms with the reality of aging. Those who knew him best described him as once being a loving and kind husband, but over time, His personality seemed to change, becoming more withdrawn, fearful, and ultimately, violent. It became clear that there were signs leading up to this tragic event, but no one had fully recognized them. It was as though the couple's deteriorating relationship had been hidden under the surface, unnoticed by those around them. The terror that Helmut's wife had felt that night was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of stress, confusion, and fear. And as the investigation pressed on, the pivotal moment came when Helmut Lockner was finally interrogated by Detective Coleman. Sitting in the sterile interrogation room, the frail 93-year-old man was a far cry from the dangerous figure he had seemed in the moments of his crime. His face was tired, his eyes clouded by age, but there was an unsettling clarity in his words when he confessed to the attempted murder of his wife. Lochner's confession was as chilling as it was heartbreaking. He admitted to everything: the attempted strangulation with the rope, the pillow smothering incident weeks prior, and the fact that he had intended to end his own life as well. According to Helmut, he couldn't bear the thought of living without his wife. In his mind, their 60-year marriage had been a bond that could never be broken. Yet, as his mental state deteriorated, so did his perception of reality. His confession was a mix of confusion, regret, and twisted logic. "I was going to hang myself with that rope," he told Detective Coleman quietly. "And so, I tried to end it all. But I failed." It was clear that Lochner's actions were driven not by a sudden outburst of rage, but by a complex combination of despair, aging, and the overwhelming fear of loss. He saw himself as a man on the edge, someone who could no longer manage the pain of his existence, yet at the same time, he couldn't bear to let his wife live without him. He described how, just weeks before the rope incident, he had tried to smother her with a pillow. Helmut explained that it was his way of taking her with him. He felt as though they had been inseparable for decades, and he simply could not fathom the idea of her living without him. However, his wife had managed to push the pillow away, and the attempt had failed. Helmut's confession had a profound impact on the family. While his wife had been left physically unharmed, the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. She had lived through decades of marriage, but the reality of her husband's violent actions shattered the image of the life they had once shared. She wasn't just a victim of attempted murder. She was a woman who had spent years devoted to a relationship that had slowly turned toxic. The fear she felt in those final moments with her husband wasn't just physical, it was emotional. A realization that her partner of 60 years had become a stranger to her. Helmut's children were also affected by the shocking revelation. They had always seen their father as a loving, albeit distant, patriarch, but now they had to grapple with the man he had become in his final years. The thought that their father, a once respected figure in the community, could have attempted to kill their mother was unbearable for them to comprehend. The Lockner family was left broken and fractured, trying to come to terms with the truth. Their lives, which had once seemed stable, were now in disarray. The past 60 years of marriage between Helmut and his wife had been tainted by violence, and the road to healing seemed uncertain. The news of the attempted murder shocked not just the family, but the entire community of Marion County. People who had known the Lockners for years could hardly believe what had transpired. Helmut had once been seen as a quiet, reserved man who kept to himself, but never someone capable of violence. Many were left wondering how such a thing could happen after decades of marriage. Friends, neighbors, and even local law enforcement officers struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the reality of his actions. "The Helmut we knew was a different person," one neighbor stated in an interview. "He was always polite but kept to himself. We had no idea that anything like this was going on in their home." But for others, the signs had been there. A few close friends mentioned that Helmut had been showing signs of mental decline, even if they hadn't fully understood the gravity of it. The interrogation room was silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Helmut Lockner sat across from Detective Jonathan Coleman, his frail hands clasped in front of him. The atmosphere was tense. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that Helmut was not the cold, calculated figure one might expect from someone accused of such a heinous crime. Instead, there was a deep sadness in his eyes, an overwhelming sense of guilt that seemed to weigh him down. Helmut's mind had become fragmented over the years, a mixture of age, poor health, and perhaps the onset of dementia. The detective's questions seemed to bring out a side of Helmut that even his wife hadn't seen. Helmut would begin to answer with clarity but then quickly trail off, as if his mind had wandered to another place. When asked about the events of October 26th, the day he had attempted to strangle his wife with a rope, Helmut seemed momentarily confused. "I didn't want to hurt her, not really," he explained in a soft voice, his words slow and careful. "We've been together for so long. I thought maybe if I went first, she wouldn't have to live without me." Detective Coleman leaned in, his voice soft yet steady. "Helmut, we need to understand. Why did you use the rope? Why try to strangle her?" Helmut's eyes flickered with a mix of regret and confusion. His voice cracked, a barely audible whisper escaping his lips. "But I couldn't do it. I couldn't take her life." The detective, who had seen countless confessions over the years, couldn't help but feel sympathy for the elderly man. There was no denying the horror of his actions, but it was clear that Helmut wasn't fully in control of his mental faculties. The desire to protect his wife from the inevitable pain of his death seemed to have clouded his judgment, leading him down a tragic and violent path. Helmut's crime wasn't just the result of a violent outburst or an intentional act of malice. It was the culmination of years of mental deterioration, compounded by the inevitability of old age. His family and friends had noticed subtle changes in his behavior over the past year, but no one had ever imagined that it would lead to such an extreme act. The role of mental health in criminal behavior is often overlooked, but in Helmut's case, it was undeniably a factor. Reports indicated that he had been struggling with dementia-like symptoms, forgetfulness, and confusion in the months leading up to the incident. It's possible that, in his mind, he believed his actions were justified, that he was helping his wife by ending their lives together. But this distorted logic was not enough to excuse his actions. His wife's life had been placed in danger, and the emotional trauma that would result from such an event would linger far beyond the physical scars. Yet, in the depths of his confession, Helmut seemed to recognize the gravity of what he had done. His remorse genuine, but too late. As the investigation continued, detectives began to piece together a timeline of the events leading up to Helmut's arrest. They were able to confirm that the attempted strangulation had occurred on October 26th, but the details of the previous incident, in which Helmut tried to smother his wife with a pillow, were equally as crucial. Helmut had confessed to both attempts, one with a pillow and one with a rope, but it was the latter that had nearly resulted in tragedy. On the day of the arrest, Helmut's wife had called 911 after managing to free herself from the rope. She had barely escaped the chokehold, and her cries for help had been enough to prompt a swift response from law enforcement. The 911 call, which was played back during the investigation, was haunting. The victim's voice, filled with panic and disbelief, was a stark reminder of the terror she had endured. As detectives listened to the call, the chilling reality of the situation sank in. Helmut Lockner, a man who had once been trusted and loved, had become a threat to the very person he had spent decades with. As the trial date drew near, the victim, whose name has been withheld for privacy, found herself preparing to face the man who had once been her life partner. The emotional weight of this moment was overwhelming. For nearly 6 decades, she had lived with Helmut, raising a family, enduring the ups and downs of marriage, and building a life together. Now she would stand before a courtroom, reliving the nightmare that had unfolded in her own home just months prior. Her testimony would be critical in the trial. She had already spoken with investigators, recounting the terrifying moments when Helmut attacked her. On that fateful evening, they had been sitting together watching television, an ordinary night that would forever change her life. Helmut's sudden violent outburst seemed like a complete break from the man she had known for so long. When the time came for her to testify in court, she was visibly shaken, but determined. As she took the stand, the room grew quiet, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on her. The prosecutor, Laura Hope, guided her through the events of October 26th, gently asking her to describe the attack in her own words. She recounted how Helmut had stood up from his recliner and, without warning, walked behind her. He wrapped the rope around her neck, choking her. She could feel the blood rushing to her head as her body screamed for air. The panic set in as she realized that, despite her attempts to break free, she was losing control. But somehow she managed to pry the rope off her neck and escape from the horrifying grip of death. In the quiet of the courtroom, the audience could feel the weight of her words. It was clear that, despite the shock of the events, she was determined to seek justice, not just for herself, but for the memory of the life they had once shared. The defense team, led by Andy Ingram, was quick to cross-examine the victim. Their goal was to show that Helmut's actions, though horrific, were the result of a deteriorating mental state rather than a premeditated desire to kill. Ingram asked the victim about Helmut's behavior leading up to the attack, trying to establish a narrative that painted him as a man who had been struggling with his own fears and paranoia. He pointed to Helmut's advanced age, his declining health, and the mental anguish he had been experiencing. The defense team argued that Helmut's confession to the police that he had intended to kill himself was a clear indication that he was suffering from severe mental distress. They suggested that, in his delusion, he had mistakenly believed that by taking her life, he would somehow be sparing her from a life without him. The defense tried to sow doubt about whether Helmut was fully aware of the consequences of his actions at the time of the attack. They painted a picture of a man who had lost touch with reality, a man unable to fully comprehend the gravity of his actions due to his mental health struggles. However, the prosecution was steadfast in its argument. They contended that while Helmut's mental state may have been deteriorating, there was no evidence to suggest that he had lost his capacity for rational thought. His deliberate actions, the rope, the choking, and the attempt to end his wife's life, spoke to a man who had, at least in that moment, made a conscious choice to kill. The jury's deliberation, a search for justice. As the trial moved into its final stages, the jury was left with the difficult task of determining Helmut's guilt. They had heard the victim's testimony, the defense's arguments, and the expert witness reports about Helmut's mental health. The evidence was compelling, but it wasn't entirely clear-cut. Was this a case of murder, or was it a tragedy brought on by a man who was suffering from a profound mental breakdown? The jury deliberated for several days, carefully weighing all the factors in the case. They discussed the severity of Helmut's actions, the impact on the victim, and the question of whether he was fully aware of what he had done. Ultimately, the decision came down to one question. Did Helmut deliberately attempt to kill his wife, or was his action a tragic result of his mental illness? In the end, the jury returned to court with their verdict. The courtroom held its breath as the foreperson stood to read the decision. The verdict, a justice that reflects the complexity of the case. When the verdict was read, it was clear that this had been a case filled with moral and legal complexities. Helmut Victor Stefan Lockner was found guilty of attempted murder, but the jury also found him guilty of committing the crime while suffering from a severe mental illness. This led to a mixed verdict where he was held accountable for his actions, but his mental state played a significant role in the sentencing. Helmut was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but the judge ordered that he be transferred to a psychiatric facility for comprehensive treatment during his incarceration. This decision was controversial, as some in the courtroom believed that a longer sentence was warranted, while others felt that Helmut's condition warranted a more compassionate approach. The victim, sitting in the front row, wiped away tears as she heard the sentence. Although she had hoped for justice, she knew that no punishment could ever undo the trauma she had endured. Her life, once filled with love and companionship, had been shattered by the actions of the man she had once trusted above all else. While the court had done what it could to hold Helmut accountable, the victim could finally begin the difficult process of healing, knowing that she would never again have to face the man who had tried to end her life. It was a bittersweet resolution, one that balanced the scales of justice with a recognition of the complexities that come with mental illness, but one that also acknowledged the strength and resilience of the victim in her quest for justice. As the gavel fell, marking the conclusion of a complex legal battle, a profound sense of justice was realized. Helmut Victor Stefan Lockner, despite his advanced age and fragile health, was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the attempted murder of his wife, a crime that nearly ended her life. The verdict, while not as severe as some might have expected, symbolized the law's unwavering commitment to holding individuals accountable for their actions. It was clear that the court recognized the need for justice, not only to punish, but also to ensure that the defendant received the care he needed, a decision that mirrored the complexities of the human condition, where justice must sometimes balance severity with compassion. The cold reality was that when someone commits a heinous act, regardless of their mental or physical state, there must be accountability. The sentence was not just about retribution. It was about sending a message to society that actions have consequences. No one is above the law, and the scales of justice will always tip in favor of those who seek to uphold the integrity of the system, even if the path to achieving that justice is not always clear-cut. For Helmut, His remaining years, however few they might be, would be spent in a place where time slowed down, but the consequences of his actions would continue to haunt him. At 93 years old, facing the reality of his own mortality, he would have little time left to reckon with the magnitude of what he had done. The weight of his crime would not be forgotten, even in the silence of his cell, and no amount of time spent in a psychiatric facility could erase the destruction he caused to the life of the woman he had once vowed to love and cherish. And for the victim, the journey had been long and painful, but the sense of closure that came with the verdict was something that would allow her to finally breathe easier. Though the scars of the past would never completely fade, the resolution of the case marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she could rebuild, regain her strength, and move forward free from the fear of the man who had once been her partner. This case, in all its complexity, serves as a powerful cautionary tale. It reminds us that the path to justice is often not a straightforward one, but it also shows that justice, when pursued earnestly, will ultimately prevail. It is a reminder that no matter the age or circumstances, if one commits a crime, they must face the consequences. And most importantly, it underscores the resilience of the human spirit, both in the face of adversity and in the pursuit of justice. And for those who choose to act in ways that harm others, the law stands as an unwavering reminder that no one is above accountability. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the story. Don't forget to hit that like button if you found the content interesting, and feel free to leave a comment below if you have any unanswered questions. And of course, don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories like this one. See you in the next video.